Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you all had a good lunch. I apologize, my voice is a bit scratchy. I've spent most of the last week screaming at the top of my lungs for the New York Mets, in vain mostly. But glad to have you here, and excited to introduce the panelists here and have what we hope is a hopeful conversation. Obviously, a lot of conversation at this conference about what is wrong with international sport right now, the problems that we have when it comes to corruption and doping and things of that nature, but hopefully we'll have a productive conversation about solutions and potential solutions in the world. First, to my immediate left is Michael Pederson. Michael's an internationally recognized expert and leader in good governance, transparency, ethics, and integrity. As the founder of M Inc., Change the Game, he works independently to help sport develop standards of good governance and also building winning strategies for building trust, growth, and performance into the future. An important advisor to many organizations. So Michael, thank you very much for being here. To Michael's left, of course, is Richard Pound. Richard is the founding president of the World Anti-Doping Agency. He's a lawyer from Montreal. He's been active in the Olympic movement for more than 50 years, both as an athlete and an administrator. He was president of the Canadian Olympic Committee and is the longest serving active member of the International Olympic Committee. As I mentioned, also founding president of the World Anti-Doping Agency, remains on that foundation's board as well. And then to Richard's left is Mike Hopper, a new add to our panel. Mike is the former commissioner of the New York City Sports Commission during the time while he was there. Of course, New York City bid for the Olympic Games as well. Mike is now a consultant. He advises cities and companies on issues of sport governance and management. Mike, thanks for being here as well. I want to start, and I'll start with you, Michael, and work to the left with the question of where on the spectrum, and by spectrum I would put at one extreme, a world of sport and an industry that self-regulates itself entirely, where there is essentially no outside interference, no government involvement, but a self-regulating world of international sport, versus at the other extreme, a very heavily regulated, with very intrusive government involvement, both nationally and internationally, into the world of sport. One can argue where on that spectrum we currently are. I'd like your thoughts on where on the spectrum from self-government to very intrusive government oversight sport currently is, and where it should be on that spectrum.
Well, first of all, it's my pleasure and indeed privilege to be here. And I very much look forward to sharing some perspectives, but also to engaging in a dialogue with the rest of you for the next 2 days. I think it's important, first of all, to acknowledge that in terms of solutions, neither complete self-regulation by sport nor complete regulation by governments can solve the issue that we are facing. Because I think neither of the two can be fully effective. We've seen that in other sectors. So for me, the interesting question is really the one you raise. How can we strike the balance right in between the two and get the perfect mix in terms of self-regulation and in terms of regulation by governments? And that is both in terms of issues and in terms of governance as such. And given what has happened in sport lately, I think we probably all acknowledge that in one way or the other, we probably need to move a bit further towards government regulation than has been the case in the past.
Dick, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in the early days of sport, it was a standalone operation. I mean, the law, the legal system, government in the late 19th century simply hadn't got there. And so sport made up its own rules, administered them, applied its discipline, and so forth. The legal order, if that's what you want to call it, got closer and closer, and it started to overlap. And I would say we're pretty close now to having sport within an overall legal order. And the issue is where are the respective competencies? I mean, government, there's no reason to think that government will run sport any better than it runs government. And that's a pretty scary thing. So you need to have a mix, probably led by sport, but in cooperation with an enthusiastic government.
Mike?
Yeah, and I think picking up on those points, and we were talking about it backstage, is the different levels of government that you start to talk about and what the priorities of those levels are. So at a local level here in the U.S., you're the agency that's bidding on events and hosting events and doing those type of pieces, and more on a federal or national scale on a global basis. But understanding each person's role in that process and what that business relationship is going to be. I mean, these entities are all entering into contracts. They all have legal provisions written into them. So what is the governance structure around those contracts for events and the larger relationship with the governing bodies in the sport?
When we talk about government in this context, what are we talking about, really? Because, of course, we have hundreds of national governments, each of which have their own perspective and potentially their own stake in the outcome of any given sport or event or regime, if you will. And then each of those governments also has a justice function. We've obviously seen in the United States, it's been the Justice Department that has taken the lead here. But then most countries also have a sport ministry of some kind. The United States does not, but most countries do have that. So is there really a government body, because there's no world government, the United Nations, things like that, that can take a role, but what do you think is the level of government or levels of government that make the most sense to look to potentially providing some solutions here when you look at global government, Michael?
Well, I think we would all want solutions to be effective. As far as I'm concerned, the most effective solution would mainly include national governments, and in the lack of a sport ministry, another appropriate authority. We've seen interesting evolving good practices in countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Holland, where they have actually developed frameworks that at least start the process of developing a common appreciation of what it is we're actually talking about and what it is that evolving good practices look like, and also how it can be tied into the eligibility of receiving future public funding. Because in most countries, sport governing bodies heavily rely on public funding. At an international level, I think it's much more complex, because at the end of the day, you both need to reach consensus, but you also need to find an appropriate authority or entity that can and will take the issue further. But looking back at some of the conversations we've had already, maybe a good place to start is simply looking at what could the role of national governments be in the countries where international sport governing bodies are based.
Dick, that could lead to very different looking regimes or situations in terms of sport governance in different countries. Different countries have different standards, different levels and expectations of transparency. So can that work, the framework that Michael laid out?
Well, I think it depends on your system of government, but I mean, there's local sport, there's national sport, and there's international sport. And so it doesn't make sense for a national government to be telling city X, this is when your playgrounds have to be open and how many you have to have. That should be local and be led by the community. At the national level, depending on whether you're in a federal state or a unitary state, the national government can certainly come in, but the state governments and provincial governments have a role, and they have to recognize that they're builders and feeders into the high performance system, and then internationally you have a national government. I think that works, and you can get the right focus on the requirements, the needs, the support, the standards, and so forth that you want to apply, and then move on, as long as everybody understands what their role is. And the city government is not the one that chooses the national team, for example.
On the international level, we all saw the reaction, not a surprising reaction, of Russian President Vladimir Putin when he criticized what he termed the overreach of the United States Justice Department in its investigation of FIFA. There's an example of what happens in politics every day, what happens in non-sport intergovernmental relationships every day over issues that are frankly much more serious than sport. So if it's difficult to get consensus on truly important issues of war and things of that nature. How can we hope to do so when it comes to sport?
That was a political response to a national issue. I mean, the United States long-arm statutes are there, they're known, and the basic thing is if you're messing with our law, we'll come and get you. And Putin doesn't like that because I don't think he liked very much about the United States, no matter what it did.
Mike, do you think that we are seeing a situation almost for sport, the equivalent to what the financial industry saw in 2008, 2009, and the increased regulation that now, whether it's the city in the UK or Wall Street here in the US, is now facing with bills like Sarbanes-Oxley and much increased regulation of the financial industry? Do you think that we're seeing sport head in that direction from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, I agree. I think we've kind of reached the tipping point on it, especially with people starting to get more understanding of how much is out there in sponsorship dollars, right? Fantasy sports here in the US with FanDuel and DraftKings, that's really opened a lot of people's eyes to its governance in a sport-related industry, right? So I think in general, you're reaching a point where you're going to need and require governance on some aspects of it, right? Now, I worked for Mayor Bloomberg for a number of years. I believe that cities are the incubator of real change. So I see from an event perspective that the city actually should be the lead versus the federal government or a national government, at least here in the US, potentially on a global scale when you're talking about ministries versus local mayors. So there's different levels of governance that you need to understand when you start to talk about government.
You mentioned cities, and there have been examples of whether it's cities or countries in the case of FIFA or cities in the case of, say, the 2002 Salt Lake City Olympic bidding process, where when you have entities that clearly have a stake in the outcome of a process, it may be difficult to expect that to be the leading entity when it comes to policing of that process. So are cities or any entity up to the national level that have this stake in the outcome really ever going to be effective? And if not, what do we need to put on top of that?
Well, I think you're spot on in saying that one of the biggest challenges to address is potential conflicts of interest, not just in sport, but also in the environment around sport. And I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution. I wish we could find a silver bullet, but I think we do need to appreciate that sport governing bodies are very different in terms of size, in terms of resources, and in terms of specific governance challenges. So as far as I'm concerned, it's really important to look at the different levels you mentioned as well in terms of finding the effective solutions. And maybe one additional aspect to the effective solutions. I think it's also important to basically distinguish between the governance of the sport governing body itself, the governance of, let's say, the playing field for athletes with issues like doping, like match fixing. And then last but not least, at least if you look at it from an international governing body perspective, also the governance of the national sport governing bodies. And I don't think you necessarily on the spectrum you mentioned want to find solutions that always, let's say, strike the same balance in between self-regulation and government regulation.
Dick, what do you think? Where should that balance lie when it comes to the sport governing bodies?
Well, I think field of play type decisions and sport rules and so on ought to be done by the sports.
Mm-hmm.
If you had an intergovernmental commission to deal with track and field, you would end up with a race of 117.5 meters, unless, of course, you come from Rhode Island, in which case it's only. And so I think all of that should be left to sport. The sports authorities understand that, and but I think they have a challenge these days of making that case, that we should be granted some deference. And you say, well, deference, yes, but you have to earn it.
Do you include doping when you talk about on the field and the governing bodies taking the lead? Do you include doping in that on the field category?
I do because the anti-doping rules are really sport specific. The sport community knows what athletes are taking. You know, they know who they are, they know where they are, they know who the bad coaches are. That's something that sport really can run, except it can't fully administer it because it doesn't have the powers to go in and say, oh, there's doping equipment, we'll take that away and use it as evidence.
We've seen, though, the clearly inherent conflicts that these organizations have when it comes to doping. The cycling federation, not particularly interested, arguably, during the many years of doping at the Tour de France, during the period when Lance Armstrong was taking the sport from a low level of popularity here in the United States to a much higher level of popularity. Clearly there's an economic interest there, or for the IAAF or any other federation to potentially look the other way when it comes to an issue of doping. So how do we expect them, therefore, to ever really be robust in their management of that issue?
Well, I mean, the answer to that was the creation of WADA,
right?
The World Anti-Doping Agency, and it still doesn't solve the problem you're raising, because your default position is you push back to the sport or to the national anti-doping organization in a particular country, neither of whom have any particular interest in catching anybody. The sports say it's bad for the sport. They work on the half empty, half full. Instead of being half full, look, we caught a bad guy and we got him out of the sport. They say, no, the world is ending and so forth. And you know, there's no interest in France of catching French athletes, or the United States or Russia, whatever it may be. So there's an inherent conflict there that we haven't quite resolved.
You know, Mike, coming from the city perspective, we clearly have seen in the last few years at the local level, when it comes to voters, a backlash against international sporting events. We've seen cities dropping out of the bidding process for Olympic Games. We saw what happened in Boston recently with their potential bid. How much do you think that is related to some of the topics that we're talking about here in this conference and the public view of international sporting events, their view of the transparency and accountability in terms of where dollars flow for those events, and how can cities potentially be part of the solution as organizations like the IOC have to search harder and harder to find cities interested to host events?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. You know, it's one, I don't think the full story is being told well about sports events or major events and what they do to a city. I think too often it gets caught in just the dollar amount, right? And that's where, you know, going back to who holds people accountable, right? In politics, you're accountable to the people. They can vote you out of office, right? So here, the people are expressing their voice that they don't want their public dollars spent on hosting those major events. But I would encourage cities, and I do now with my business, of making sure your public is informed on the entire story, right? And be an active participant from the bid phase on. Don't just answer a bid and put a general document together. Take the time to talk to your community and understand what events are they interested in, why, which ones will they support, which ones will they come out and buy tickets for. That way you're starting from a much stronger standpoint when you actually do get to the point of hosting an event and the legacy of that event. So I think, I honestly don't believe it's been done very well to date. I think there's a lot more that not only the cities can do, but the entities that own the events. Now I do think the IOC has made phenomenal progress. They've changed their bidding patterns, and they are being far more open and transparent with potential event hosts. I think there are other organizations that could learn a lot from the way that those changes have been made and how they approach a potential location host.
Michael, I'll get to you in a moment, but I want to get Dick's take on this question, because arguably the bidding process, and I know the IOC president Thomas Bach has made reform of this process a top priority, but you think you can argue that that process can be part of the solution potentially, as you know, particularly in democratic countries where voters do have a say in whether the city bids for an event or not. They are looking at international sport and deciding themselves whether they think the transparency is sufficient to justify spending their tax dollars.
Yeah, actually, interesting enough, in something the size of the Olympics, you can actually pay all of the Olympic overlay from non-tax-based dollars. Between television and sponsorship and tickets, you can cover the cost of the Olympics.
There's always the issue of guarantees, though.
The guarantee, there's not a lawyer in the room here that would tell you that guarantee is worth the powder to blow it to hell. It's unenforceable. So give it. I mean, I'd advise anyone to sign the guarantee, then nobody can sue you on it successfully. But I think getting the information, all of the relevant information out there, and starting to make a successful bid, your backswing is a lot more important than get your community groups involved. Say, well, this is what it'll do. This is what it'll mean to the Bronx. This is what it'll mean to Queens. And this will be good for us if we can get it. But in order to get it, you've got to be behind it. And I think that's the change that we're seeing. And plus, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. And if you look at the last games we awarded, we had a choice between Kazakhstan and Beijing.
Yes.
For Winter Games. Two completely different things, all of which would fit within the Olympic Agenda 2020. Beijing, no snow. You get on a high-speed train and go for an hour or so, and it'll be artificial snow, but it's going to open winter sports to 300 million Chinese. Think of being in the snowboard business. And Kazakhstan was one of the classic winter cities, and in either one was justifiable on the basis of the new criteria.
Michael, when we talk about government and their ability to make a difference in this entire area, I look back at the United States and the issue of doping in baseball and the steroids issue. And that was an example of the US government using its power to threaten and cajole more than actually taking any direct action. They held hearings in Washington on the issue. Some legislators made threats to take baseball's antitrust exemption away, which is a significant lever that government has in the United States against that particular sport. But what is the most effective tool that government has when it comes to getting leverage and forcing change? Is it criminal prosecution, as we have seen certainly come up over the last few months? Is it economic funding? What is the best way for government potentially to make a difference?
Well, I would certainly always follow the money in terms of, let's say, building a case around maybe pushing people or pulling them a bit towards the desired behavior. And in many countries, sport heavily relies on public funding. So obviously, there is an opportunity there, as seen by governments of Australia, New Zealand, UK, and others, that you can eventually tie the eligibility for future public funding to making sure that at least sport governing bodies meet a minimum criteria of standards jointly developed. So I think that's a potentially very effective tool.
Let me ask you though, if a government says we're pulling funding from this organization, whether it's a national committee or a national governing body for a sport, of course the reaction one could immediately make to that was, well, you're hurting athletes. You're not hurting the administrators or the people who are actually, they have their hands in the till, as it were. At the end of the day, you're hurting athletes and their development. What's the response to that?
Well, I don't think there is a silver bullet, the solution I described for you, I don't necessarily always see as the most effective and desirable one. I was just tempted to answer your question.
Of course,
I mean,
yeah.
if it had to be very effective, what could be done? No? Of course, you need to look at things in a broader perspective and also identify potentially unintended consequences. No? And that kind of encourages me to share a perspective around what I see as a growing tendency as well. I mean, we look at sport as the solution to, or we tend to more and more look at sport as the solution to any societal issue that we are facing. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we need to appreciate that sport reflects society with all its beauty and all its flaws. But it cannot be the only side of the coin to do everything in the best possible way. You know? It's part of the problem and the solution. I always try to look at people in, let's say, in a simplified way along the lines of three different kinds of people. I mean, they're the people who will always cut corners, no matter what kind of rules and enforcement you put in place. No? So the thing to do with that kind of people is basically to say, we will find you and we will prove that you have done something wrong and you will be sanctioned. No? Then you have another group who will always do what is right, no matter the incentives around it, simply just because they feel like doing the right thing. And then you have the biggest group in between, the ones who can either do one or the other, depending on how they are motivated. And that's where I think the main role of government actually should be emphasized. How to motivate the majority of people who can be motivated to do what they know to be right, or maybe to slightly cut corners if useful, if needed.
Michael raises an interesting question early in his comments, which is, are sports being held to a higher standard than other industries? And should that be the case? Mike, what do you think?
Well, I think it goes to the topic of the panel, right? I mean, in some senses they are. They're kind of the cure-all, right? But in other senses, they're not being held to the same standards as the financial industry, right? So it really depends. The more that somebody can take a global view of sport and really understand all of the sectors that it touches, all of the benefits it has, all of the flaws it has, then they can make the decisions where sport makes sense for them, right? So it's really more of an individual assessment. I think there are plenty of grassroots programs throughout the world that are using sport effectively for either social cohesion or health and wellness benefits or those type of pieces. But it's certainly not the answer everywhere.
Dick, from the IOC perspective, should sport be held to a higher standard?
I would have no objection to that. I mean, we pride ourselves in being an ethically driven sports movement, and therefore it's important to hold people to those standards. It's one of the reasons the Salt Lake City crisis was so difficult for us, is we're out there running an ethical sport movement, and we've got some of our members who are not acting ethically. But to go back to Michael's point, you know, how you package this for the solution that we're looking for is not that we're pulling funding, and therefore innocent athletes are being, say, you know, because my country's in Canada, we think it's important that our tax dollars be properly applied, and we're certainly, one of our priorities is to finance sport at the national or whatever level it may be, and so we're going to have a funding program to do just that, and the funds are available if you meet certain criteria. Mm-hmm. Not that we're punishing you for not having, but as from this day forward, there's a pool of money. You get your share if you can demonstrate that you have proper governance in place. I think that's a pretty painless way of getting compliance with what you hope is the right kind of conduct.
The United States obviously has taken a very central role, particularly in the FIFA situation that is happening right now, in large part really for two reasons. Number one, a statute in RICO that is very amenable and pliable to tackling issues of corruption, allows prosecutors very broad discretion and limited statutes of limitation in terms of going back and prosecuting efforts or untoward behavior that goes back years. And of course, the other reason is the fact that it is the financial capital of the world, and therefore all sorts of transactions use the U.S. banking system, and that allows the U.S. to claim jurisdiction over things that are quite broad in nature. Michael, I'll start with you. Do you think that the U.S. Taking this lead role in a very complicated political environment around the world, in which the U.S. is sometimes seen as the sole superpower, and others may not like that role the U.S. plays. Do you think that this can work with the U.S. taking the lead, or does the United States need to potentially step back and become more a part of the global community as opposed to being a leader here?
Well, I think it's always important that someone is taking the first step in showing leadership. And I think the step that the US has taken in the context of the FIFA case, I think has been very important in taking things to the next level in terms of the general appreciation of something needs to be done. I'm not sure it's the long-term solution that the US is, let's say, acting as the police force of the world vis-a-vis sport. And I can't help think that there is basically one reason why we're spending a couple of days together and why we all care about governance in the world of sport. And that is actually the fact that there is government failure, both at a national level and at an international level. Because if we had effective government, then we would not need to worry about all these issues. We could just get down to organizing beautiful sport events, a beautiful game, and taking good care of the athletes. But given the fact that there is a lack of effective government, then we need to address all these issues. And I'm reminded of many of the conversations I have with quite progressive and idealistic sport leaders that I meet around the world. And many of them basically say, I mean, if you look at my membership, if you're in an international sport governing body, maybe you have like 200 national sport governing bodies as your core membership. If I look at my membership, often if I talk about governance, I can have a conversation with like 50 of them. The rest not interested. Mm-hmm. And that is because of the situation of their own country. So in that perspective, governance is just not a winning issue for someone to, let's say, represent the entire membership.
Dick, can the U.S. lead this?
Well, I think the U.S. has probably put the sort of the lever and the fulcrum together. And I don't know how far it has to go, but I mean, I think in a number of serious countries around the world, they say, well, thank God for the U.S. I mean, we love them, we hate them, but this is the right thing to do with FIFA. It's clear that there's been a problem for a long time. It's equally clear that nobody was prepared to do anything. You know, I think in many of the countries that Mike was talking about, the local football association is probably more powerful than the government. Mm-hmm. And so nobody was going anywhere near it. Now you've got all of those elements in place to bring about a change that, along the lines that Francois is leading. There's a reason to do it now, and everybody has woken up to the fact that, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. It could have been my country, it could have been me. We better get out of town and do the right thing. So in that sense, the US will have led a significant change. And you've now got Switzerland into it.
Yes.
You're going to have other countries that are looking at their football confederations when they see what's happened. God knows what conversations have been taking place in Zurich in small dark rooms for the last few weeks, mm-hmm. as people try and recognize A, that they're in trouble, and B, try and mitigate that difficulty.
Mike, what do you think the risk of backlash is, though, against the United States for what some might argue is an overreach of U.S. jurisdiction?
Yeah, well, I think certainly it was right on the U.S.'s part to lead. I do think it's time for coalition building, right? Start to get a broader base of people that really want to see change in that area. Listen, I think the U.S. It certainly got the blowback in the international media, right? How come they overreached, and why did they feel it was their need to do that? But I haven't seen a change in strategy from an event perspective. Right? People aren't saying, well, we don't want to go to the U.S. now. Look how far they reached on that. We don't want them digging into what we do. So I haven't seen that level of backlash. So I think there was some short-term anger. There was some short-term media stories about it. But it seems like at this point, people really kind of came together around the idea somebody needed to do it.
We're short on time. I want to give each of you a chance before we finish. If you have one idea, one implementation that you think would be an important step, whether it's globally, whether it's with a specific federation, a specific organization, or a specific country that you think could really move the ball forward in increasing transparency and all the things we're talking about here in this conference, what do you think would be a good first step or next step, let's say, as we try to move forward on this? Michael?
Well, I always think it's useful to look at what we can learn from others and what is already working. I mean, it is useful in this process to point fingers at what is not working well. But I have come to appreciate that in the world of sport, there are actually a lot of aspects around governance, if you only look for them, that work well and that can be scaled and replicated elsewhere. So I guess my encouragement at the end of this conversation is to maybe make more of a collective effort to find and highlight and recognize cases of good governance in sport that we can all learn from and embrace and make good use of in the process of, let's say, further developing our thinking on what needs to be done.
Yeah, in our case, I think probably the IOC has made enormous progress from being at the bottom of the barrel covered with manure in 2008, 2009, through major transparency to an organization that is now generally recognized as being somebody that, there's one that practices our best practices. So there are lots of things that we did that might be helpful to others.
Yeah, I think picking up on that, some sort of global entity, not entirely sure what that structure would look like, that really educates event owners on the changes that have been made at the IOC to make sure that any event owner, whether it's international, national, local event owner, understands what it means to be transparent through a bid process. Great thing to see.
All right, well, thank you, Michael, Dick, Mike, all three of you for this. Thank you to ICSS for allowing us the conversation. Thank you all for staying and listening. Appreciate it.